this will be the first in a Revit lesson, so I still have the SketchUp file open. We developed the 2 floors. There's still a good bit of work to do, but if I were doing this in Revit Architecture, which I'm going to start now, find it. Remember, Revit projects default by assigning default level 1 and 2. So you're already looking at two stories, right? 2 levels, 2 building levels. So when you import, when we're going to create a new project, it's good to understand the differences between how Revit deals with 3 space and how SketchUp does, right? SketchUp requires you to do a bit more work. Revit creates a lot by default that you could take advantage of and use as constraints. So when you model elements in Revit, while this doesn't require knowledge of Revit, it assumes some understanding. When I start a new project in Revit, I always start with an architectural template. Construction template creates additional structural levels that you don't need. New project default, okay. So this is not an intro to Revit, but it is a fun, rudimentary set of steps of how to model this competition drawing. So you're going to import that CAD drawing. It helps to know where it is. From the insert menu, you link CAD. You never import the geometry directly because you don't want stray geometry in your model. So import a link to CAD. Let's find, have patience because we're using what's called a virtual desktop, and where do we put these? I'm going to pause this and find the file, okay? So I copied them to my documents folder. This is the one that we made a slight modification. We included some grid lines. We really don't need those because we're going to use Revit to create those grid lines. But for illustration purposes, let's open that drawing. And remember, we drew all over. And unlike SketchUp, this preserves annotations, really preserves anything visible in the CAD drawing. So by default, this is pinned. You have to unpin it, select it, unpin it, and move it into place. The first thing I would do, always quickly turn to a default 3D view to see what it is that you're doing. So Revit generates, because AutoCAD is geometry, it's vector geometry. It's like a 3D object, except it's flat. If I go to an elevation view, we can see that by default, Revit creates level 1 and level 2. Now, we had made some inferences. We decided that level 2 was 14 feet. If I were to make a level 3, I would add that 14 feet above it. So let's go ahead and just create another elevation at 14 above that and call it level 3. It defaults to level 3. So keep in mind the levels that we're drawing upon. Let's draw the grid lines. Grids are architectural elements. Architectural grid. 1, 2. There is a grid here. There should be. Although it's not expressed on the front of the building, but there's a structural element implied that maybe I'm reading too much into the drawing. Anyway, it isn't critical. Technically, you would create a midpoint here as a grid line. Now, the grid lines going horizontally. Let's make those letters A. And the neat thing about Revit grid lines is you can use them to place elements at the intersections. I'm going to start with 2x2 columns. You're given a drawing that's largely a curtain wall, right? Or a building that appears to have structural slab independent of large open space with probably perimeter structural elements as well, and we'll talk about that as I model them. Architecture column. Do not choose structural column. Choose architectural column. You need a square one. It loads a rectangular one by default. How convenient. It's 2x2. Right. Before I place it, let's see what Revit wants to do by default. Sometimes I quickly place it anywhere to see what it's doing, and then go to a 3D view to see what it wants to do. Columns are a little bit tricky, so let's see what it does. It goes from level 1 to level 2. That's what we want. Right? So if I go back to this view and place these columns at the intersect, you notice how it's snapping to the grid lines. It's doing what I want. I might be missing that alignment. I did that in SketchUp as well. So there's the intersection of the grid lines, placing those columns. What's going to be a little bit trickier is at the perimeter. So I'm going to continue to draw some grid lines for the purpose of placing these columns. If we want, later we can use the grid lines to adjust the spacing. So I'm going to add grid line to this wall. Let's use an endpoint just so that we know where we are. Probably want to use the core of the wall as center line or something. Endpoint. Endpoint. So be consistent whatever you use so you can remember what you're doing, and then endpoint again over here. So now we have places. Oh, and we need 2 more. Endpoint. Let's make that a number. what number are we on? 7. I drew it the wrong way, so I'll just place the label on the bottom there. Architecture grid. Endpoint. There. Now we have intersections to draw columns at the perimeter. Architecture column. Column architectural. I'm snapping to the intersection of the grid lines. I think I left that consideration out in SketchUp. 3 and 4 are these anomalies that are part of the core over here. Didn't extend the grid lines far enough, but that's where they intersect. There's more columns than we need here, but that's okay. They're going to be buried in these walls. Or, if you decide that you want to articulate the facade by, whoops, moving these out as pilasters, so they're a little bit differently placed than they were in SketchUp. Let's go to a 3D view. That's what we have going on so far. Just like SketchUp, I'm going to decide on a wall thickness. Go to Architecture Wall, click the default, and I'm going to duplicate a generic 8 and make it a generic 24. I'm going to spend a lot of time figuring out what was intended, you know, in that facade. It isn't going to matter. 24 inches, 2 feet, right? And when you're drawing, you want to draw from level, use as a base constraint from level 1 to level 2. So from level N to level N plus 1, so to speak, up to level 2, and use a location line, finish face exterior, so you could draw clockwise. If you draw anti-clockwise, it'll reverse the face. So I'm going to start drawing somewhere so you can just sort of see what I'm doing. Drawing clockwise, right, through all the geometry that's there. So let's go to floor plan level 1. That's how I want to draw. Now, hiding these columns is a little trickier in Revit. If they're interfering with what I'm doing, I have to go into Visibility Graphics, VG. Whoops, sorry. I was still in wall draw mode. I didn't resolve that command. So escape, modify, VG. Let's hide columns for now and continue to draw the wall. A generic 24. I'm going to start, always start somewhere you remember, and I'm drawing in clockwise direction. Exterior face of wall. You can ignore everything else. what appears to be a mistake is because these windows are drawn with one element completely inside another. The wall, sometimes walls have trouble resolving these turns, so let's go unjoin, which is fine. Not sure. Oh, I tried to make a turn there, sorry. Maybe a wall in the model. Let's go to a 3D view. Well, columns. All right, sorry. Columns were inside each other, inside the wall. That's okay. Let's go to level 1 and continue drawing. So even though the columns aren't visible here, the geometry that collides will issue a warning. Let's continue drawing the wall. Notice I'm snapping to the outline of the wall and not that sill that's projecting beyond it, clockwise. It's pretty cool that Revit does all this work for you in terms of, if I switch view here, let's see what it's done already. Let's continue drawing. What's going on here? I don't know. That. So the wall's coming up a little short there. They're asking you to believe there's some fatter structural element embedded. In the wall, almost there. And then, as long as you intersect the wall you started with, escape modifier, it'll join it neatly. So we've modeled floor 1 and floor 2. Floor 1 walls and columns. In the next lesson, we'll deal with the floors and the interior wall cores.